Boozy Art Historian, and I'm your host, Janelle D. Thumb. Come on in and pour yourself a drink or two as we discuss the wild world of art history. Hello, I'm your host, Janelle, and today I'm talking about art and medicine, specifically medicine before 1850. In this episode, I'll cover a small history of medicine, types of medical treatments, and how medicine is represented in art. Now, just to touch on the webpage associated with this episode, I want to make sure you all know that you can view all of the images and resources I discuss in this episode on my website, www.boozyarthistorian.com, or by clicking on the link in this episode's description. On my website, you will find all kinds of goodies, specifically web pages dedicated to each podcast episode I produce. Just click on the link to the episode you want on the website's homepage, and you'll find the episode's audio, transcript of the audio, and accompanying resources and images. Right, now that I've done all the housekeeping, let's get into the good stuff. Before we go any further, I would like to note that this particular focus is on Western art and medicine. That is not to say I don't believe that Eastern art and medicine aren't worth discussing. To be honest, it's fascinating and deserves its own episode. If I had put both of these together, it would have been a 3-hour episode, which honestly is just a bit too much. I'm hoping to do an episode soon on Eastern art and medicine, so if you have any artworks or medical history topics you would like me to discuss, feel free to send me a message through the contact section of my website or DM me on Instagram at boozyarthistorian. Now, there are 3 rough time periods I like to break the history of medicine into: early medicine, monastic medicine, and scholastic medicine. Each of these 3 periods are filled with fascinating scientific discoveries, and I highly recommend you having a look at the resources section of this episode's accompanying webpage. To quickly sum up, early medicine is everything before the year 1000 CE. For those of you who are unfamiliar, CE means Common Era. It's a bit more of an inclusive way to date history rather than the Christian focus on AD, meaning after death, which is referring to the death of Christ. If you hear me mention BCE, that translates to before Common Era. Now, monastic medicine is everything from roughly 1000 CE to about 1800-ish CE, and scholastic medicine is everything from that 1800-ish CE to present. When discussing the history of Western medicine, it's important to remember that they didn't have access to technology like we do today. People had to work with the knowledge they had along with trial and error. It's also important to remember most of the world before scholastic medicine was driven by the supernatural. Now, when I say supernatural, I mean things like religious influences, because those are in fact supernatural, and the cosmos. I would even go so far as to argue that the supernatural is still connected to medicine currently. There are things that happen within the human body that we can't explain with modern medicine. The supernatural quality to medicine is what's important historically and even to this day, because it gives us some sort of explanation as to why our bodies are doing the things that modern medicine can't explain. People turn to the supernatural to give some kind of semblance of control over something that seems unexplainable and uncontrollable. Examples like this include demonic possessions, which were not necessarily seen as illnesses of the body, but rather as repercussions for breaking a taboo, whether it be social or religious practices like spells. Magic plays an important role in medicine. We see magic in medical history so far back as ancient Egypt. Now, it's important to note that for Egyptians, magic was less about using spells that would cause harm and more about creating cures for illnesses. Along with magic, trial and error was a major component in Egyptian medicine. What is particularly interesting about the trial and error is Egyptians wrote down their results. So anything from spells or simple non-invasive surgical procedures such as setting broken bones would be written down for future medicinal practitioners to use. 2 wonderful examples can be found on this episode's webpage. Image 1A shows a piece of an ostrakhan with a medical recipe on it, and image 1B shows a tablet with a list of magical stones and their healing properties. These types of artifacts are exciting to historians since it gives us this rare glimpse into how people healed one another, as well as how also people wrote, which is very exciting. Another culture that we see writing down their medical procedures are the ancient Greeks. What's really fascinating about Greek texts is they were used as official or unofficial medical texts for almost 1,500 years after they were written. For Greek medicine, disease was believed to have a more natural rather than religious cause. This is not to say that the supernatural didn't play into their ideas of medicine. For example, certain gods and heroes were associated with health and disease. The main god being Asclepius and his two daughters, Hygeia, who is the goddess of hygiene and general cleanliness, and Panacea, who is the goddess of general health. As we know from film representations of the ancient Greeks, for example, Disney's Hercules, that many towns in Greece had temples dedicated to different gods. Many towns in Greece are recorded as having a temple dedicated to Asclepius. In image 2 of this episode's webpage, you can see an example of a relief which depicts a woman who has just given birth with a woman behind her holding the newborn baby and a large female figure in front of the seated woman. This relief was most likely commissioned by the seated woman depicted in it as a gift to Asclepius or Hygeia for allowing her to survive such a dangerous medical moment. Fun fact, it's from the Greek, in which we get one of the most important parts of modern medicine from, the Hippocratic Oath. This is the oath that doctors take when they graduate from medical school, where they vow to do no harm. Hippocrates was a real person. He was born around 460 BCE and died around 380 BCE. Hippocrates was all about reasoning and was a member of the Asclepius Guild. He also went on to write the Hippocratic Corpus, which contains the main points of disease is natural and that one must utilize empiricism and prognostics when treating patients. More importantly, the Hippocratic Corpus acted as a practical guidebook, which listed techniques for medical practitioners to use. It also created an ethical and professional framework for the medical world. The most important text to stem from this was De Materia Medica. De Materia Medica was a 5-volume encyclopedia that outlined the medicinal uses for various herbs and natural elements. It was created by Dioscorides, a Greek physician to the Roman army around 50 CE. De Materia Medica is still to this day considered one of the longest lasting medical texts ever. It was translated into many different languages and permeated the globe. In image 3, you can see an Arabic version. On this particular page, there is a little picture showing 2 men preparing a medicine from honey. The recipe is written below the image, so it's almost kind of like a recipe book, if you will. As an art historian, what I find particularly fascinating about this artifact is that the 2 men are in a building that is believed to be a depiction of a pharmacy. In the region of Seljuk, which is today the region we know as Turkey, specifically the region around Istanbul, it was very common for hospitals to have pharmacies attached to them. So it's quite fun to see a drawing representing this building and helps give us an idea of what these pharmacies would have looked like. We also see another example of this in image 4, where we see these wonderful oxen grazing, and inscribed on the page are the medicinal uses for the oxen. With that being said, I would like to turn to our next time period, which is the monastic medicine. A major component of monastic medicine was humors. Humors made up the majority of all medicinal diagnoses and treatments. Now, when I say humors, I don't mean something funny. What I mean is 4 components of the natural world that people believed every living thing was comprised of. You can see a diagram that I created on image 5, which helps visualize the various parts of each humor. The 4 humors included blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Now, each of these humors coordinated with a specific season, symptoms, and even personality traits. Blood was associated with spring. It was believed to be produced by the liver and was an indicator of outgoing personality traits. For example, people who had just the right amount of blood in their humors were considered friendly, they joked and they laughed frequently, and their skin had a slightly rosy tint to it. If they had too much blood, then they could be considered sort of foolish or have a bright red appearance. Yellow bile was associated with summer. It was believed to not be a great humor to have since most of the coordinating traits aren't very kind. For example, someone with yellow bile would have been bitter, short-tempered, and daring. They also would have had a greenish or yellow tinted skin color. Black bile was associated with autumn. It was believed to be an indicator of depression secreted by the spleen. People who had black bile in their humor composition were considered lazy, fearful, and sickly. Black bile was also associated with people who had black hair and or black eyes. Fun fact, cancer was also considered black bile. So in some historical texts, you'll see things written about the removal of black bile, which would have meant a cancerous growth. Last but not least, we have phlegm, which was associated with winter. It was also considered an indicator of reserved behavior. Those who had too much phlegm in their systems would have been low-spirited, forgetful, and have white hair. What I find incredibly fascinating is people believed that your birth date would dictate your humor makeup, and therefore your personality and physical build. Now, we have to remember during this time period that astrology and astronomy are the same thing. So your personality and genetic makeup being dictated by where the planets were in accordance to the stars was not outlandish for people to believe, and some people to this day still do believe in these types of things. We can see a wonderful example of this in image 6, which is a page from Fascicolo di Medicea, which shows a male figure with all of the constellations covering the coordinating parts of the human body that they rule. This particular book is a compilation of medical knowledge and incorporates not only medieval knowledge, but also Renaissance knowledge. What I love about this particular image is we see the influence of Giovanni Bellini and Andrea Mantegna that they had on the illustrator, most likely Johannes de Catham. There are some additional illustrations in the text that are quite interesting to look at as well, so I highly recommend clicking on the link associated with image 6 to see them all. But I digress. Going back to the idea of the cosmos and everything within them is made up of these 4 humors, also helped people diagnose and treat illnesses. For example, if you went out on a cold winter day and you caught the common cold, then it could be remedied by balancing out your other 3 humors appropriately. You could promote an increase in yellow bile by sitting by a fire to help counter the excess phlegm and black bile in your system. One of the most common solutions to balancing one's humors was bloodletting. For example, if one was suffering from a bad bout of vertigo, they could apply leeches behind their ears to help with the symptoms. Bloodletting was also used as a preventative measure to make sure that the humors would stay balanced. As dangerous as bloodletting was, I cannot stress enough how important it was to the history of modern medicine. Without bloodletting, medical practitioners would have never figured out things like blood transfusions. I also want to quickly pause and remind everyone that these sorts of medical practices may seem archaic, but at the time were considered the standard. Germ theory was not a thing until the 1850s, so the supernatural and magic filled in these sort of blanks that people couldn't really explain in medicine at the time. Now, the next object I wanted to talk about is proof of people using magic as a sort of homemade medicine. Not homeopathic, but also not truly medicine. Anyone who knows me will know how much I adore gilt coconuts, so this is one of my favorite objects in this episode. Image 7 is a particularly fetching example of a gilt coconut, and I had the pleasure of seeing it at TEFF Maastricht a few years ago. What makes this a magical object is not the gilt additions or the carvings on the coconut, but rather the coconut itself. During the Renaissance in Europe, coconuts were extremely exotic and expensive objects. So to show off one's wealth, people would have these intricate gilt mounts added to the coconut so they could either display it or drink from it. And now, because coconuts were so exotic, there was a level of mysticism around them, and people thought drinking from a coconut could offer healing properties, especially when it came to poisoned beverages. It was believed that if one put a poison drink into a coconut cup, the coconut would neutralize the poison and make it safe to drink again. This is obviously not true, but we see this belief permeate all over Europe for quite a while. Another object that was believed to have magical medicinal properties were bezoars. Yes, exactly like the thing we hear about in the Harry Potter novels. Much like using coconuts to neutralize any illness, one could scrape off a bit of the gray part we see in image 8 and add it to a beverage or food, or just pop it into your mouth, which I can't imagine would have tasted very good. And it would have cured a variety of stomach or poison-based illnesses. We also see the covered jar in image 9, a different sort of example of how eating exotic things would affect the body. This particular type of porcelain was made in Mexico and was very expensive to ship to Europe. Of course, Europeans loved it because it was luxurious, but also because they would eat it. Europeans believed that by eating the exotic porcelain, they would absorb the healing qualities of it, and that would help keep their skins white and pale. At this time in Europe, it was quite in vogue to have ghostly white skin, so women did everything they could to achieve this look. No, not everyone was eating this porcelain. Most people would drink from it, and they believed it would give them the same qualities as eating the porcelain itself. It was particularly popular in Spain to drink from such vessels. And we can even see a wonderful example of this in image 10 in Diego Velázquez's Las Meninas. In it, we see the Infantada Margaret Teresa surrounded by her maids of honor, which are sort of like ladies in waiting, if you will. And one of them is actually serving her a drink out of a Mexican ceramic vessel. With that being said, I've been talking about the wealthy elites of Europe and their medicine, or what they believed was medicine. I can't say that taking bezoars or the drinking from a coconut was actually beneficial to them medical-wise, but either way, I would be remiss not to mention the rest of the people in Europe and how they accessed medicine, which actually leads me back to the term monastic medicine. During this time period, there aren't hospitals like what we have today. It was mainly religious institutions that acted as places where one could access medical assistance. The downside of this is that many of the cures these religious institutions could offer were rather spiritual rather than physical. Many of the religious monasteries or convents believed medicine was an accessory to their sacred religious mission. They believed that an illness was a symptom of his soul being impure. So any cure they prescribed wouldn't necessarily be things to make you feel better, but rather to prepare your soul should you die. Such cures included things like praying, penance, and calling upon the assistance of saints. I think it's also important to note that monks and nuns were forbidden to practice medicine for temporal gains, aka make a profit off of it. Of course, we know that praying and repenting weren't actually very helpful, and one important woman felt the exact same way, and that woman being Hildegard von Bingen, who's depicted in image 11. Some of you may know her from Outlander Season 2. The show, of course, got the time period horribly wrong. They were off by about 600 years, but I appreciate that they tried to highlight an important woman in medical history. Hildegard von Bingen believed that one must keep both the mind and body strong against the devil. In her medical work, she kept religion and medicine separate. Well, as much as possible during this time period, and for someone who operated within a convent. There were also others who began to work with corpses to better understand how the human body truly worked. Of course, they had to work in the shadows since it was illegal to dissect a human body in Europe up until roughly the 15th century. The reason for this was many religious entities and religions believed that one day we would need our bodies for the afterlife, and by desecrating them, it would cause a soul to be without a body come Judgment Day. But when it does become less taboo to dissect bodies, we start seeing fascinating illustrations of muscles, bones, and circulatory systems, as we can see in images 12A, B, and C. Two of these are by Leonardo da Vinci, one of the most well-known figures of Renaissance Europe. It's quite fascinating to see how he drew out the human figure and the details in the bones and structures. And from here, we started to see a general increase in tools that help doctors and the scientific community better understand medicine, all the way up to the 1850s, where there was kind of this huge renaissance, if you will. Most of it is similar to what I've discussed, but if you are interested, you can join my beer-only membership, which is just $3 a month, and have access to a mini episode I put together on the little bits I couldn't get in today. I also recommend checking out the resources section of this episode's webpage, which of course is free to anyone. And if there's anything I want you all to walk away with from this episode, it's that medicine has a long history and understanding the human body has been a very lengthy process. With that being said, I hope you all found this episode incredibly helpful in understanding a brief history of medicine through art. Should you have any questions, comments, or thoughts, you are welcome to DM me on Instagram at boozyarthistorian. You'll also find fun drink recipes on my TikTok account, and you can find fun art history facts on my more sober account at The Curious Art Historian. If you liked this episode or any of my work, please consider donating so I can keep all of my episodes ad-free. You can find me on Buy Me a Coffee under Boozy Art Historian. You can also keep up to date on all of my upcoming episodes and other news by subscribing to my monthly newsletter. No spam, just one email at the beginning of each month highlighting upcoming episodes and news. You can subscribe through the link in my Instagram profile or through my website, boozyarthistorian.com. Thanks for listening in, and see you next time on The Boozy Art Historian.